I want to welcome you all to the 16th Annual Diversity Matters book series. And today we're going to be joined by our speaker who will talk on the Earthkeeper, Reflections on the American Land. My name is Debbie Lahota. I'm the advisor in the TRIO program here at Metro. And I'm kind of excited about this because I'm very interested in Native American history. So we have with us Dr. Brady Desanti. He's going to be our discussion leader for the book. And the book is written by N. Scott Momaday. I hope I'm saying these names correctly. Dr. Desanti is an associate professor of religious studies and Native American studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He's a director of UNO's Native American Studies program and is a citizen of the La Courte Oreilles Ojibwe tribal nation. He also possesses Bad River Ojibwe ancestry. Dr. Desanti focuses courses and research focus on Native American, indigenous spiritual traditions, and Native American history. So welcome, Dr. Desanti.
Hey, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoyed working with Barbara Velasquez, who I know has retired, but she really helped bring this together, and so it's nice to meet you all here today. And I am battling allergies, so if I cough a little bit, I do apologize. It's time for me to get my allergy shot here, probably
that time of year.
Right. I do teach at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and I have kind of an interesting kind of background. I was adopted at birth, and I know my birth family quite well. My biological father was from Havana, Cuba. My birth mother was Ojibwe, or what the Ojibwe in Ottawa and Potawatomi call themselves is, in their own language, is Anishinaabe, which means the people or human being. And so we're citizens of the Oreilles Ojibwe tribe out of Hayward, Wisconsin. And then you've got two other Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin that we have ties to. It's Bad River and Red Cliff. So it's been a great honor to be at UNO. I was an undergrad there from 1997 to 2002. And I got my master's and Ph.D. at the University of Kansas, and I was fortunate that UNO had an opening on their special faculty development program in '07. And so I started there, and kind of the rest is history. So as far as this book, I thought that it's more sort of vignettes of Momaday's views on land and his experiences, how land has sort of influenced his understandings of his own Kiowa heritage, which is in Oklahoma, but also tied to other parts of the American Southwest. He had a lot of experience with indigenous communities like the Navajo, or the Dene, as they call themselves, in various Pueblo communities. And I think historically, Momaday's influence on Native American literature and poetry can't be overstated. So he was born in 1934. And just to sort of situate what was going on in terms of the nation and what was going on with tribal nations and indigenous people in the United States at that time, prior to that, from about 1887 to 1934, federal policy had been geared towards one of assimilation. So the wars had been pretty much over and so forth. The reservation era was in full effect. And so 1887 is one of those times that you start to see the boarding schools here in the United States and residential schools in Canada, where children were sent very far away to these schools that were designated to Americanize and Christianize indigenous people. That's a very, very difficult chapter for Native peoples here and First Nations people in Canada. There was also the outlawing of Native American religion for a time. And so that pendulum shifted in 1934 because we're in the Great Depression, and there was a shift in federal policy towards tribes. We call this era the Indian New Deal era, or the Indian Reorganization Act era. That, in a sense, it temporarily stopped some of those assimilationist policies and allowed tribes to reconstitute their governments. And it temporarily, took the outlawing of native religion away as well. So there was a window for a time until, of course, the end of World War II, where the policy temporarily shifted back to one of assimilation. That Momaday came of age during this era, and a lot of his work is really it resulted in a kind of Native American renaissance in terms of creative writing and poetry. He dealt, Housemaid of Dawn in 1968, I believe, dealt with the World War II experience. And I think that book has a lot of what his memories are here in Earthkeeper in terms of, at least in story form, about the trauma of war. And a lot of Southwestern tribal nations have specific ceremonies to heal people from the war experience, to deal with things like PTSD. And the influence of the land here is crucial. And you can see the influence if you like Earthkeeper and you go and read Housemaid of Dawn. I would also suggest Leslie Marmon Soko's novel Ceremony from the early 70s, which also deals with a Pueblo returning combat veteran from World War II that deals with the trauma of war and healing. And I think that, Soko has said that Momaday played a huge influence on that. So his birth coincides with the Indian New Deal at the start, really, of the Great Depression era. And that was a dark period for Indigenous people as well. And so I think his work laid the foundation for many, many Native creative writers and other authors and poets and so forth. And he just passed away this January of 2024. I think it was in his late 80s. So he wrote a lot of excellent stuff. And kind of to understand this, I'm not an expert on Kiowa cosmology and traditions, but a lot of what he talks about the land, I thought I would kind of dispel some stereotypes that are out there sometimes. And one way of understanding that is that the Kiowa, like most tribes and indigenous people globally, if you look at their creation stories, and there are some exceptions here, but most of them have human beings to be amongst the last of creation. And you can interpret that a couple of different ways. One avenue would be to say that the creator saved the best for last, right? But for indigenous people, if humans are amongst the last, then that's interpreted that we're like the younger siblings of everything that came before us. And there's a humility to being human. And there's an awareness and appreciation that the land itself predates human beings here, as well as the plants and animals and other natural features, the landscapes, the clouds, the stars, the waters. And contrary to what a lot of scholars and anthropologists thought in the late 1800s to about the 1940s, the stereotype was that indigenous people worship the plants and animals and the natural features. On the contrary, I think a better way of looking at that is to see that the concept of personhood and who a person is very limited in Western conceptions. When we think of persons, we think of human beings, and we kind of align those two. But for indigenous people, and Momaday I know would agree with this, that the concept of personhood is much more expansive. And so it's possible within this kind of thought world and philosophy that you can be a person without being a human being. And so within this cosmology, you have your animal relatives that are people, animal people, plant relatives, star people, cloud people. And within those creation stories, you learn that as the younger sibling of all of that preceded you, that you have, how I would put it, as kinship obligations and that towards your relatives. And the key to those relationships with the natural world and your plant and animal relatives, it kind of hinges on reciprocity and maintaining balance. And now within that sort of construct then is how I would put the phrase as other than human persons. And so if you take that, what Momaday writes about in this book, his feelings about the land, it's more than just sort of an aesthetic, right? That the land is beautiful and so forth. What he's really talking to is that Native peoples, through those creation stories and through living on their homelands for centuries, that you develop a very profound relationship to that land, to place. And that your frame of reference for who you are as a human being and as a member of your tribe the frame of reference for that identity oftentimes stems from the land itself, which is a relative. And just as the land provides for you and sustains you, that you, in a sense, basically understand your obligation that you belong to that place as well. And so I think that it kind of helps us get away from some of the romanticized stereotypes that are out there that, that we hear Mother Earth, and I'm not saying that that's not part of sort of the philosophy or aesthetic of indigenous people, but it's not general. It's very much based upon this land over there is occupied by another people who have their own relationship to it. For us, this is our land, and this is the land that we have our relationship to. So it's always not that land, it's this land upon which I rest, upon which I have my culture, my relationship. And what always kind of intrigues me too is I know that he's talking about his sort of experiences with the American landscape. And a lot of that is beautiful, but for Native peoples and sacred sites and places, it's not necessarily based upon, as I said earlier, the aesthetic appeal of it, the beautiful sunset and a creek going through here and green grass, that there are places, particularly in the Southwest, that are believed to have a power in them that it may not look to, an outsider to be beautiful, but it's the power within that place that something occurred there a long time ago, and that it made such a profound impact that people go and pilgrimage there and perform ceremony there. So and I can certainly, I'm happy to talk about, different levels of sacred sites. It's just to help with the frame of understanding for that. But I think it's a beautiful book. I think that he throws in some Kiowa and certainly Navajo traditions in terms of how to relate to the land and so forth. But I think that concept is useful to relate to the land as a relative. It's sort of the frame of reference for your identity. And it comes out of having lived there for a long time, and that stories are passed on through your community about that place. And so it's not an abstraction, I think. And that's kind of, and Momaday had obviously a way with words for expressing that sense of relationship and belonging to the land. And I would almost say too, that, how should I put this? I think here in Western religion, what we think of as Western religion, Christianity, to an extent Islam and Judaism that have had an influence on the West, we tend to treat the earth as sort of an object. I think that almost any place that's convenient to human beings is a place where you could build a church or a shrine or a synagogue or a mosque. And for indigenous people, that's not the case, that the place itself kind of takes the initiative to reveal itself as a place of power. And that's where Native peoples go to. So it's not a place that Momaday doesn't see these places as sacred because he sort of designates them as such based upon convenience or how pretty they are. That these places within his frame of reference and within his tribal communities and others, that the place itself almost takes the initiative, if you will, to reveal itself as a place of power. And people could go there for vision quests, which are oftentimes rites of passage ceremonies to mark the transition from childhood to adulthood. Medicine people will also do that to acquire new power and so forth. So these places, I think, hopefully that's helpful to sort of give a frame of reference to how Momaday is approaching this. That the concept of personhood, that he's including plants and animals and the natural features as almost different types of people, not human being, but different types of people that indigenous people have these kinship obligations to, like relatives. And so the land basically also becomes part of this rich web, this tapestry of complex relationships. And I think that's that's certainly an aesthetic that I think is not necessarily always prevalent in the modern West in terms of how we look at land and so forth as a commodity, and oftentimes something that doesn't seem to have any integrity unto itself. And here Momaday reminds us that the earth and the natural features and so forth it certainly has a worth and an integrity apart from its use to human beings, I think, from that standpoint. One way of looking at sacred places, I think, you could look at it like in 4 different categories. And I would start with the premise that the Kiowa and Momaday, I know, had written about this elsewhere, that the power of the spoken word, oral traditions, which is how a lot of these teachings and beliefs are passed down, that stories have a power to them. And so if you're a traditional storyteller who has earned the right to be able to do that, there's certain protocols that have to be observed and appreciated. And traditionally, young people that showed sort of a predilection for having a good memory and good morals would be taught the sacred narratives and traditions of the community, and they'd be tested over time. I also think that if you're a storyteller, if these are living traditions, right, for a religion to be relevant from an indigenous standpoint, it has to be alive, and the creation stories are alive. So when someone tells that story to you, it's almost an act of creation on the spot, that the storyteller tells the story and you, the listener, you take in that story and you become a participant in the creative process. And so the stories that are about creation stories or about sacred beings and so forth, that when you tell that story and listen to it, I always tell students that the temporal demarcations between the past and present are sort of dissolved, and that story is not just about the past, it's really about you in the present. And so the words have power. And Momaday was a very good poet as well. And certain stories would only be told at certain times, because this is also a very personal universe filled with many different types of people. And names have a sacred power. So if you call someone by their name, you might be calling them into your presence. I'm reminded in the Great Lakes with the Ojibwe, they have the story of the Anamiki, the thunder beings, which are always doing battle with the water monster. And if you've ever seen in the Great Lakes a storm there with lightning hitting the water, it's quite a sight. And it was believed that the Anamiki were the protectors of the Ojibwe. And the water monster is sort of unsavory, imbalances things, can drown people. And in the Canadian side for Ojibwe people, they still respect the protocol to not say the water monster's name, because you don't want to call that power into your presence. The only time it's safe is, any guesses when you might be able to say the water creatures or entity's name? Would be in the winter when the lakes are frozen over. And so there's protocol to when to tell stories, to say certain names. And as a storyteller, Momaday basically would be aware of that and so forth. And you can see something of our relationship to the earth is determined by the particular place we stand at a given time. You know, I'm looking through on page 38 of the book. I think Momaday basically, that's kind of the background. I kind of wanted to position what he has to say here and how he relates and speaks about the land and the various landscapes and geographies that he encountered through his life, both in Oklahoma, where he was born, and other parts, where he lived amongst other Southwestern indigenous peoples as well. So, but you can certainly look at sacred places. I think that we've all heard of the Holy Land, which for many people, for the Abrahamic faiths, are in the Middle East. But here, the Holy Land for indigenous people is filled with landscapes and geographies that are believed to have sacred power and so forth. So I thought really quick too, one way of looking at categories or levels of sacred sites for Indigenous people, and this isn't like, um, you know, concrete in the sense that it's that there is some flux here. This is just sort of a useful exercise. I would say like level one could be places that are made sacred by the actions of humans, not anything supernatural and so forth. That somewhere that humans engaged in behavior that made that place memorable. Unfortunately, a lot of these places are places where violence occurred. I know for like a lot of Indigenous people in 1890, the site of Wounded Knee. For the United States, it could be places like Gettysburg or Ground Zero from 9/11. That people make memorials out of those places and remember the sacrifices that were given and the lives lost and so forth. So that would be like category one. I think category two or level two are places that, like otherwise ordinary circumstances, something powerful happens. The sacred manifests itself in a powerful way. I think in religious studies, the term I would use is hierophany, which is like interruption of the sacred. So during otherwise ordinary circumstances at a particular place, the sacred manifests itself, makes a huge impression on the community there, and then that place becomes a place of power. And I think a good example of that is Momaday, when he was born, was taken to, in Wyoming, what in English has been called Devil's Tower. I think everybody's probably heard of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. It's sort of a disparaging name, and I try not to use it other than to just say what I'm saying here. It became really popular in 1977 during the Steven Spielberg, one of his first movies, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the extraterrestrials make their final descent at, quote, Devil's Tower. But it is a place that's sacred to many different tribes in the area. The tradition that I'm most familiar with is what the Lakota call it Mato, M-A-T-O, Tipula, T-I-P-I-L-A. Mato Tipula means Lodge of the Bear or Bear's Lodge. And the story there for Lakota and some other tribes is that one story is that a brother and sister were being chased by a bear. And at the time, Mato Tipula was really small. And it communicated to the brother and sister to stand, come stand on me and I'll save you. And as they did, the tower itself grew very tall. I think it's about 800 feet tall. But as it grew, so did the bear. And the bear almost got them. If you look at Mato Tipula, it looks like claw marks down the side. And so there's variations on that story that Momaday would be aware of as well. And then for the Lakota, one tradition is that Mato Tipula was the site where Te, P-T-E, white buffalo calf maiden or a woman, approached two Lakota hunters. They were out looking for food. Their people were starving. And that she told them to prepare in their community for she would arrive and she was going to bring a great gift from Wakantanka, the great mystery. And so they did. And she came wearing these white garments and she gave them the sacred chanupa, the sacred pipe that the Lakota use in most of their ceremonies, and she gave them 7 sacred teachings. And then she went into the 4 directions, and each time she turned into a different colored bison or buffalo. And on the last one, she turned into a white buffalo. And so she's become known as White Buffalo Calf Woman. And white buffalo or bisons that are born white are oftentimes seen as a great, kind of great things to come, a good omen. And so Mato Tipula for the Lakota, because of that level 2, under ordinary circumstances, a couple of guys out there looking to hunt, that an emissary on behalf of the great mystery appeared out of nowhere with sacred power, Wakan, for the Lakota. And so that is a site in the Black Hills that the Lakota make a pilgrimage to. And usually native ceremonies, the ceremonial season for a lot of this starts June 21st, which is the summer solstice. And I think that's a good example of level 2. And Momaday obviously had an attachment to Mato Tipula. I don't know what it's called in Kiowa or Cheyenne. It's very sacred to the Cheyenne as well. And then, of course, level 3, I would say, is kind of bleeds into level 2, that since time immemorial, that certain places that seem to have power, that Native peoples have gone there, and the place seems to provide healing and visions and so forth. And so it's sort of, the place has always had a power unto itself with no real specific tradition that makes it sacred. It's just this ongoing, it's always been there. And then another way of looking at sacred sites would be that, again, these are living traditions. And so it would make sense that that if certain places have been revealed before as having sacred power and being having sacred qualities, that new places could be revealed as well. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because so many tribal nations were forced from their homelands. Particularly, probably the most notable examples of that forced removal would be the tribes that formerly lived in the American Southeast, North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Muskogee, who had millennia of relationships with places in the Southeast. When they were forced into what was called Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma in 1907 with statehood, each of those nations lost about a quarter of their populations. Collectively, each one of them is known as the Trail of Tears. When they got to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, parts of Kansas, they started to develop new relationships with those places, and new stories and new places revealed themselves as sacred. And of course, the Kiowa were also basically, put into Indian Territory and so forth. So Momaday here, what he's writing about, I think he had such a rich background being Kiowa, but also experiencing the traditions and living with the Navajo and various Pueblo communities and so forth. He obviously has a very unique perspective and unique voice on how to write about these things. So his contributions, as I said at the outset here, really can't be, you can't say enough about his power as an author, his ability to paint pictures and emotions with words. I think that when you read this, he's very eloquent, and then his influence on subsequent Native American authors that were very open about what an influence he played on them and so forth. And I think he is responsible for starting what I see as a kind of Native American renaissance of authors, particularly that around the World War II era, post-World War II. As I said, Leslie Marmon Silko and many others. I know Vine Deloria Jr., the famous Standing Rock Lakota intellectual, was very close with Momaday. And, that's Susan Schoen Harjo as well. So when he passed away in January, there was a deep mourning and outpouring of love and affection and a lot of memories throughout Native communities and tribal nations throughout the United States. And in Canada, he was also well known and respected by other Indigenous people outside of the United States. So I would like to open things up to any questions, any insights, and so forth. Hopefully that was somewhat helpful to give sort of the intellectual, philosophical background of Native thought when it comes to land and plants and animals and so forth, to sort of help us sort of grasp some of the meaning of Momaday, of what he's talking about in terms of his own appreciation for land.
Okay, there are a few questions here. So do you have a favorite piece that Momaday wrote?
For me, Housemaid of Dawn, his first one. And I know that's cliche to say, but I think that knowing that there's a complex history about Native American involvement in the military. And my students are always kind of astounded, and most people are, because we know all the broken treaties and the toll that colonialism has taken on Indigenous people. But Native Americans have the highest enlistment rate in the armed forces per capita of any ethnic group. And one of the reasons for that, I'll be really quick here. World War I in 1917 was when the United States got involved. The war started in 1914. But that's a time in which boarding schools are in full effect. Native children who became teenagers and young men at these schools were used to a very regimented lifestyle, taking commands and orders, a rough life. And Native religion was also outlawed. One component of Native spirituality was the warrior societies, which are obviously still with us, to help veterans come back and deal with what oftentimes is understood as a ghost illness, which is PTSD, making peace with the trauma of war. But there was also this idea, particularly in the plains, of if you went off to war and conducted yourself honorably, did what you had to do, you brought honor back to your people. And so you had about 17,000 Native Americans enter World War I before Native people were U.S. citizens. That came about in 1924. And the reason that they did this is a lot of avenues to express their tribal heritages and cultures were forbidden by the assimilation era and the federal government. So they saw basically kind of a new enemy, Germany, that they could go off and kind of perpetuate some of these old value systems and earn honor with their people again. So it was never about patriotism back then, the first instance. It was about perpetuating indigenous values and traditions on their own terms. I know the Iroquois Confederacy, which is 6 large tribes, they call themselves the Haudenosaunee. They declared war on Germany both in World War I and World War II, independently of the United States. And so that military involvement is kind of a funny, humorous thing on the side, is that there was a German author in the early 20th century leading up to World War I that had never met Native Americans. Carl Mann, I think his name was. And he just sort of romanticized Native Americans as either very stereotypical, that one with nature, that they were spiritual, one with nature, peace, love, harmony. But at the same time, if you mess with them, they were the ultimate warriors as well. And so when U.S. generals saw that they were going to have some Native Americans in World War I, they asked some of them to wear some of the old war regalia and put them in the front lines to scare German soldiers. Because you can read journals by German soldiers in World War I, terrified that they were going to have to fight what they saw as the ultimate warriors and so on. So that's kind of an interesting history, but it started a lot of Native American involvement in the armed forces to this day. And so my own father, who raised me, was a veteran of Vietnam in 1969, a combat veteran. And I always look at like House Made of Dawn, which deals with the ravages and the toll of World War II on a Native American veteran. And I look at Leslie Marmon Soko's book, Ceremony, which looks at the main character, Taya, and his complications. I always see basically those scenarios as opportunities to learn about Native value systems and healing ceremonies. And I think Momaday started this, and Soko picks up on it, that the main characters who may be dealing with what we would call today PTSD and a sense of loss of meaning, where the life has lost its color, which is really what trauma can do to a person, that their road back to recovery and healing isn't just for themselves, but in the sense that by healing themselves and getting help, that they provide healing to their communities and to their ancestors. So we hear about intergenerational trauma, there's intergenerational healing. And I think House Made of Dawn and Ceremony, those books really provide a powerful way of understanding and learning about Native value systems in a unique way. And so I'll always go with his first book.
What are the levels of sacred places?
I was influenced by a book chapter from 1991 by Vine Deloria Jr. called Sacred Sites and Religious Freedom. And he developed these categories as helpful to when Native Americans oftentimes want access to a sacred place that is now in a national park, federal lands. They have to oftentimes get permission from the Park Service to perform ceremony. And sometimes the parks now are very good, but it didn't used to always be that way. Or if those lands now are under private property, the court system oftentimes would not be very well versed on Native values and how they conceive of sacred places. And so Deloria wanted to help a non-native audience kind of understand how native people see sacred sites. And so that category one would be simply places that are made sacred by the actions of humans, not necessarily anything, quote, sacred or supernatural. And unfortunately, I mean, you can find examples in our own personal lives that maybe don't have anything to do with violence, but from a national standpoint, like Gettysburg, Ground Zero with 9/11, the site of the Oklahoma City bombing in '93, places for Native Americans like Wounded Knee and Sand Creek and so forth. Those are sacred, and they're sacred places from that level one, I think would be a way of putting that. Level two would be places that under ordinary circumstances that it's believed that the sacred or the sacred powers of the cosmos sort of reveal themselves there in a very powerful, visceral way. And that makes such an impact that that place then becomes a place of pilgrimage and ceremony. And I use Matotipula, quote, Devil's Tower, that the English called it, as a good example for the Lakota, which I'm more familiar with, but Momaday had that personal relationship with it as well. Level three is sort of just places that seem to have always been associated with power, that there's no sort of one beginning or one occurrence, that they've just always had a sacredness to them. And then level four is sort of that new places can be revealed as having power. And I think that's particularly useful because Native Americans and their tribal nations have been forced sometimes hundreds of miles away, and they have to develop new relationships with the land that they occupy. And so there's this openness to, that's why I always say that these are living traditions that can change over time and incorporate new experiences and places.
Thank you. Okay, now, what are some practical ways we can bring back the awareness and perceptions of our relationship with the land and the importance of that connection to our present culture?
Wow. Well,
that's a good one, huh?
Yeah, if I had that answer, I think world would be a better place. I think one way of thinking about it is we make a distinction, and have for centuries in Western thought, between nature and civilization, right? And there is no word in Native American languages for religion or nature, right? And so those categories sort of separate us. So at some point, we've grown apart from the earth to where we see ourselves separate from it. And as a consequence, that we're sort of separate from our other plant and animal relatives, that we're kind of at the top of the pyramid. And that leads to an estrangement, I think, between, how am I related to the land? How am I related to the plants and animals? And that's hard to get back to because we've so commodified everything in our way of life, the land itself, and we've commodified other human beings and so forth. And getting back to that sense of compassion and empathy, to not see things as less than. In most native languages, there's concepts that speak to all my relations, my relatives. The Omaha and the Ponca have a phrase, Iwa de Wanga de, which means all my relatives and my relations. And the Lakota, Matakiase. I think the Ojibwe, Akina Oia. And it speaks to, not just our human relations, but all my relations, my relatives, that we're all here. And I think that just sort of a mindfulness of how we're related. And I know indigenous people, it's always in the creation stories where these plants and animals are here before us. And their actions at the beginning of time are sort of roadmaps for how humans are later to treat one another. So it's the animals who actually are responsible for showing what compassion is and how to treat other people and how to reciprocate gifts. And I think that humans could learn a lot from that sometimes.
Totally agree. Totally. Okay, this kind of relates to the earlier question. How does the land show it's sacred, or how does it call out to the Native Americans?
Well, I think that you can find non-Native Americans who have lived in the same area and their families for generations, hundreds of years, and they will report similar occurrences that Native people as well, who have lived in the same lands for centuries as well, that you learn the rhythms of that place. The place has a sort of personality to it, and it starts to showcase aspects of its personality, and that human behavior and the way that you almost think about things is sort of tied to the rhythm of that land. and how that land sustains all of these different peoples and nations, if you will, of plants, animals, humans, even the stars above that landscape become part of that tapestry of your community. And I think it's just living in those places and observing how things are. Observing, for instance, the bear, what berries it eats and plants and so forth that are poisonous and non-poisonous, right? Is basically, stories would be told about the bear as the bringer of medicine in some traditions. So I think that there could be these broad sort of big time examples of the sacred making itself known, like at Matotipla and other places. But then I also think that just living in that place for a long time, that certain places become associated with for vision quests, that this place seems to have a power to it. And so we, here on the plains, if you hear someone's being put up on the hill, that's sort of shorthand for a vision quest for that young person. Paying attention to your dreams. You might have dreams at certain places, and those dreams might be very powerful in one place and not so powerful in another. So it's just having that time to experience life in the various dimensions of human experience over time. And the land seems to reveal certain experiences that are more conducive than others.
So are there any sacred places near Nebraska that anyone can visit?
It's near Fremont, and it was sacred to the Pawnee, who are, of course, in Oklahoma now. Pahuk. I don't know how to spell that, but it's believed that the earth lodges that the Pawnee would live on were replicated in the lower world by animals that overseen their own houses. And Pahuk was made sacred. I think that a young boy was unjustly murdered by his father, and Kingfisher basically took this boy to all the councils of the animals at their own earth lodges underground. And the animals held a council, and it was only at Pahuk that they decided to raise the boy from the dead, and that boy became a medicine person. And Pahuk was visited by the Pawnee. I don't know if it still is. Last I'd heard, you can read about it. Peter Nabokov wrote a book called Where the Lightning Strikes, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the best books, because it's like a biography of Native American sacred places. So Peter Nabokov does a good job, and he writes extensively about Pahuk. I know in Valentine, as a traditional near the Niobrara, is the sacred lands of the Ponca, the northern Ponca. So you've got the southern Ponca in Oklahoma, and you've got the northern Ponca here. There's stories that are very sacred to the Ponca in that area. I can't give specifics to that. And I'm more familiar with certain places in Wisconsin and so forth. But I was going to say, it's kind of about a 5-hour drive, but Effigy Mounds, which is technically in Iowa, but it's pretty much Wisconsin. I like to go there as a place because there are tribes like the Lakota in Nebraska, the Winnebago, who traditionally saw Effigy Mounds as a sacred place. And it's beautiful that you've got burials there and so forth, but then the effigies are giant animals, and you can only see them from way up in the sky. So
this is an interesting question. It says, maybe a little off topic, but did you see the recent movie Killers of the Flower Moon? And if so, how historically accurate do you think it was?
I did see it. It's about a 3 hour and 40 minutes long. It's based upon a book, and the book was well done. I think the movie was accurate insofar. I mean, Jim Gray was the former principal chief of the Osage, who worked extensively with Martin Scorsese, the director. And the Osage really felt good that they felt that they were listened to. There's other Native Americans that have said that it still played to certain tropes, that the main characters were Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro's character. But I know Lily Gladstone, who's an excellent actress. She is Blackfeet and Nez Perce, that she did an excellent job. And the first script for that movie apparently was so heavily focused on the non-Native American characters that Jim Gray and other Osage took a dinner with Martin Scorsese, and they just said, you've got to center us much more. This is our story. And they rewrote the script and apparently centered the Osage more than they would have been. So I think that, you'll get different views on that movie. The Osage and originally from Missouri that are in Oklahoma now, were by and large, from what I understand, pretty happy with how it turned out to have that story focused on, because most American audiences aren't aware of, that whole story. It's one of the first FBI cases to find out who was murdering Osage people for the oil rights and so forth. So I was comfortable with the movie. As a non-Osage person, though, I will defer to them and their work on that movie.
Okay, this question says, which other books would you recommend for Native American spirituality? I know you've mentioned a couple.
I think that my favorite, and it's a non-Ojibwe author, but she did an excellent job, is called Island of the Anishinaabe by Teresa Smith. So if you look in Amazon, Teresa Smith, you'll find the Island of the Anishinaabe. I think that a lot of the hero for a lot of Native people was Vine Deloria Jr., and his book, I think, that has a lot of his best work is called Spirit and Reason. It's like his greatest hits. If you're looking for a lot of his writing from the 60s through the 90s, that's called For This Land, Writings on Religion in America. And then his sort of most famous one from the 70s that's been updated is called God is Red, which was sort of a play upon an Episcopal bishop who in the 70s said God is dead, and Deloria said God is red, and kind of his take on Native religion. Vine is very political. He came of age in the Red Power movements of the Civil Rights era. So he can be kind of acerbic, and he can be funny and sarcastic. So, but he's also was one of the best sort of Native intellectuals, I think, that we've had in a long time. So Island of the Anishinaabe is really good.
Could you give me his name again, the one that did Spirit and Reason?
Vine, Vine, and then Deloria is Deloria, Vine Deloria Jr.
Thanks.
And then a really good book I use in my Native Religions class is called The Price of a Gift. And it's by Joe Eaglelelk and Gerald Mohat. Gerald is with the Gerald, Mohatt. And it's really the story of how Joe became a medicine person.
Awesome. Okay, I think there's one more question just popped up, and it is, there used to be a place called Falling Leaf west of Grand Island where people went for sweat lodges. Have you heard of this?
I have not. Where I go, I don't have much of a life these days, but when I get a chance, I go to my mentors up in Whiting, Iowa. Carolyn Fiska's Big Mama, she's well known around here. She's been recovering from some health issues, but she's Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, but practices Lakota ways. And so I go up there once in a while for a nipi, is what the Lakota call a purification lodge. But you do have at the Ponca Center sweats. So I think there's all sorts of sweats around Nebraska. You just kind of have to know, but I'm not familiar with. I was actually born in Grand Island. My birth mother was pretty young, and she had run away from home, and so that's where she gave birth to me. So that's my tie to Grand Island, and I used to play against them in baseball in high school. So, but I'm not familiar with that particular sweat.
This question says, what contemporary Native American authors would you recommend for further reflections on increasing our connection to the land? And I think you just answered that for us.
Right. One I would throw out, I just reviewed her newest work, and Devon, she's Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and she writes a lot of Native American sort of contemporary issues, is Devon Miasua, Devon. Let me spell her name. Mihesuah. So Mihesuah, Devon, Devon. And I think that she's really a good person to look at. I think if you're looking for really creative nonfiction, her autobiography is very funny. She's hilarious, but there's also a lot of really hard-hitting stuff about contemporary Native life. Is Tiffany, Tiffany, Midge, Midge, and her book is Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's. Sort of Ann D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And I think that's a very powerful piece.
Oh, what happens when a story is forgotten? And are there any areas that used to be sacred but have been forgotten?
I'm sure that there have been with the millennia of native inhabitants to these lands. I think stories, they can be forgotten. I'm sure they have specifics sort of elude me, but we look at right now because of the boarding school and residential school era. And then, of course, after World War II, for a time, there was the relocation movement. Well, this is why about 71% of Native Americans live in cities today, in urban areas, as a result of post-World War II policy. Because of that, language retention has been a real crisis in Native communities. And so with the death of an elder, oftentimes it exacerbates the loss of language. And language is really basically how you relate to the land through story, through history and oral tradition. And so I know that some things have been lost just as a result of that. And you started to see really in the 60s and 70s a resurgence, a sort of Native American renaissance of trying to recapture what was still there and to protect it, and to also deal with the loss that did take place, of traditions and so forth.
How do Indigenous people look at the designation of corporations as persons? I don't know what that means. You might know what that means.
Well, I think that there's Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court case that granted personhood to corporations. I think it's been I'm just going to give my opinion. People can disagree. And I think that's not exactly in line with the values of indigenous, understanding that other biological forms of life they are persons, different types of people with volition, with their own integrity and their own sort of prominent place. I don't know if corporations, which is, I personally, and I will just speak for Brady and Desanti, that I'm not a fan politically of granting, quote, personhood to corporations, businesses, and so forth. So I don't find that to be very helpful.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you on that. Right. Okay. Well, does anybody have anything else that they'd like to add? I know that this has been very, very good, very interesting.
Oh, thank you.
The information that you've put out and stuff. I'm frantically scribbling all these authors down on my paper so that I could look them up, because I love to read, and I like to read things that make a difference sometimes. So,
great.
Excuse me. So, Dr. Desanti, this has been awesome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and hope everybody's doing well. And thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for your time, because I know you've got a lot of work, and I'm looking at all the books behind you there.
A lot of those are graphic novels. So, okay. Well, thank you all so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye. And then for the audience, we'll be posting a link for the evaluation, plus it's on the screen that you can catch the little QR code. And for the next event, it's Triumph After Trauma. It'll be Thursday, April the 25th. I would encourage you all to attend if you can. So thank you guys for attending. Thank you for coming today. If you have any questions, you can direct those to Sarah. And if you want information about any events coming up, just get a hold of Sarah. So enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.